The fire didn't start by accident. It started with permission. May 31st, 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma. A black man stood on Greenwood Avenue and watched everything he built turn into smoke. His name was O.W. Gurley, and in that moment, the American dream was burning in real time. Not a metaphor, not a symbol, an entire economy erased in a single night. Buildings collapsed, money vanished, generations of work turned into ash floating through the dark. And the most dangerous part, it wasn't hidden. It happened in the open, watched, allowed, protected, because the flames weren't just destroying property, they were destroying proof. Proof that black wealth had existed. Proof that black independence had been real. Proof that the lie at the center of America could be exposed. So the system did what systems do when truth gets too loud. It burned the evidence. Then it buried the memory. For decades, schools stayed silent. Textbooks skipped pages. Teachers moved on quickly. No smoke, no bodies, no empire, just nothing. And when history forgets on purpose, you have to ask a harder question. What exactly were they trying to hide? Because Greenwood wasn't supposed to exist in the first place. This was the Jim Crow South. Segregation enforced by law. Violence enforced by custom. Opportunity locked behind skin color. Yet inside that pressure, something impossible grew. Banks, hotels, doctors, lawyers, theaters glowing at night, money moving through black hands, staying inside black streets, multiplying where the system said it couldn't. They called it Black Wall Street, not as a nickname, as a warning, because wealth creates power, and power without permission terrifies the people who think they own the future. O.W. Gurley understood that before anyone else. He wasn't born rich. He wasn't handed safety. He wasn't protected by the law. He was born just 3 years after slavery ended. 3 years. Close enough to still feel the chains in the air. Close enough to understand exactly what freedom was supposed to mean. So he did something radical. He bought land. Not just a house, not just a store, land. 40 acres in a dusty corner of Tulsa most people ignored. A place white investors didn't want. A place nobody believed could become anything. But Gurley wasn't buying dirt. He was buying possibility. Then he made a decision that changed everything. He sold only to black families. Think about that for a second. In a country designed to keep black people dependent, he created a place where dependence wasn't required. No begging for jobs, no waiting for permission, no shrinking to survive, just ownership. And ownership spreads fast when people finally taste it. More businesses arrived, more families followed, more money stayed. Within 20 years, Greenwood wasn't just surviving, it was shining. Luxury cars rolled past storefront windows. Music drifted from theaters into warm night air. Doctors treated patients in offices they owned. Children walked streets where success looked normal, not rare, not miraculous, normal. That might be the most dangerous thing of all, because oppression survives on one belief, that the oppressed cannot rise. Greenwood destroyed that belief every single morning the sun came up, and systems built on lies don't ignore truth. They erase it. The accusation came fast, thin, fragile, convenient. A black teenager, a white elevator operator. A rumor turned into gasoline, and suddenly the city was boiling. Crowds forming, weapons appearing, anger rising like it had been waiting for permission, because it had. Violence doesn't explode from nowhere. It builds quietly, year after year, fear feeding it, jealousy sharpening it, power protecting it, until one spark feels justified. Night fell, and Tulsa changed forever. Thousands moved toward Greenwood, not hiding, not whispering, marching, some wearing badges, some carrying rifles, all carrying certainty that nothing would stop them. And nothing did. Gunfire first, windows shattering, people running through streets that hours earlier felt safe. Then fire, block after block igniting, homes collapsing inward, businesses turning into furnaces of heat and memory. Smoke climbed into the sky like a signal no one answered. By morning, 35 blocks were gone. Gone. Not damaged, not struggling. Gone. More than 300 black lives erased. Thousands homeless. Millions in wealth. Stolen in silence. And O.W. Gurley stood in the middle of it, watching an empire disappear. No army came, no rescue followed, no justice arrived, only ash. But here's the part history tried hardest to hide. Greenwood wasn't unique. It was a pattern. Across America, wherever black wealth gathered, violence followed. Different cities, same ending. Burn, steal, erase, rewrite. Because if one generation saw undeniable proof of black success, the entire story of racial hierarchy would collapse overnight, and power cannot survive truth that clear. So the names disappeared. Not just Gurley, hundreds more. Entrepreneurs, landowners, builders of worlds most people today have never even heard of. Hidden on purpose, forgotten on design, buried beneath polite versions of American history. But memory has a strange habit. It waits, quiet, patient, refusing to die completely, until someone starts asking questions loud enough to hear the answers. Because Gurley's burning street wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a secret most textbooks never dared to tell, a secret carried by 7 names they tried to erase forever. And once you hear the first one, you can never look at American history the same way again. So the real question isn't what happened in Tulsa. The real question is, how many empires had to burn before the truth could finally be hidden this well? Before Tulsa burned, before Greenwood proved black wealth could rise in plain sight, there was a woman the system couldn't explain, so it tried to erase her instead. Her name was Madam C.J. Walker. And the first thing you need to understand is this. She was never supposed to exist. Not in the version of America built after slavery. Not in the story told in classrooms. Not in the quiet rules that decided who could succeed and who had to disappear. Because Walker wasn't just successful, she was undeniable. Born Sarah Breedlove in 1867, 2 years after slavery officially ended, she entered a world still shaped by chains that hadn't fully vanished. Orphaned young, married too early, widowed too soon, working endless days over washboards for coins that barely fed her daughter. Nothing about that beginning suggested power. Nothing suggested wealth. Nothing suggested history would ever remember her name, and that's exactly why her story mattered. Because the most dangerous proof against oppression is someone who rises anyway. Walker didn't wait for opportunity. She studied survival. She noticed what stress and harsh chemicals were doing to black women's hair. She noticed the absence of products made for them. She noticed a market no one else respected enough to serve. And where the world saw neglect, she saw possibility. That's where the shift happened. Not overnight, not magically, but quietly. She experimented, mixed formulas, tested solutions, refused to stop when failure whispered that she should, because poverty teaches persistence in ways comfort never can. What she created wasn't just hair care, it was independence in a bottle. And independence spreads fast when people are desperate for control over their own lives. Walker built a network of black women selling door to door, not just earning money, but earning dignity, not just making sales, but building community, not just surviving, but choosing their future. Thousands of women, then tens of thousands, money moving hand to hand inside neighborhoods that had been designed to stay empty. By 1910, her company wasn't small anymore. It was unstoppable. Factories running, agents traveling, wealth multiplying faster than anyone expected. And by 1919, she crossed the line. America didn't know how to process. $1 million. Let that sit for a moment. A black woman, born to parents who had been enslaved. Standing inside wealth most white businessmen would never touch. Not second place, not symbolic success. Real power. And power without permission always creates tension. So the system did something subtle. It didn't burn her empire. It did something quieter. It tried to rewrite her story. Whispers started. Claims she didn't really build it herself. Suggestions that someone else must have been the real mind behind the success. Because admitting the truth would force America to confront something terrifying. If a black woman could rise that high, what excuse remained for inequality? So history softened her edges, shrank her brilliance, reduced her to a footnote when she should have been a headline. But Walker refused to shrink while she was alive. She bought a mansion beside the estates of white industrial giants, not for comfort, but for statement. A message carved into stone. Black excellence does not ask permission to exist. And that message echoed far beyond wealth. She funded scholarships, supported civil rights efforts, invested in futures she might never personally see. Because true power isn't measured by what you keep, but by what you build for others. Yet even that wasn't the full truth. Because while Walker's name slowly faded from public memory, another woman stood behind the curtain of history, even wealthier, even more erased. Her blueprint shaped an entire industry. Her generosity changed thousands of lives. Her fortune once dwarfed the legends people still celebrate today. But mention her name now, and most people stare blankly, which tells you everything, because forgetting isn't always accidental. Sometimes forgetting is policy, and the deeper you look into America's past, the clearer that pattern becomes. Rise too high without permission, and history finds a way to lower your voice, but silence never lasts forever, because the next name buried beneath the ashes of memory isn't just another success story. It's proof that black wealth once reached heights so extraordinary, the system had to pretend it never happened at all. So now the real question shifts. If Walker's $1 million shook the narrative, what happens when you meet the woman who was worth even more and was erased almost completely? Before America learned to whisper Madam C.J. Walker's name, there was another woman already building something larger, not louder, not more famous, just bigger. Her name was Annie Malone, and the silence around her story is not an accident. Because Malone didn't just succeed inside the system, she built something the system couldn't easily touch, a world of her own making. Born in 1869, another child entering freedom that wasn't really free, another life beginning with limits already written into the rules. But Malone carried a different kind of vision, not the dream of survival, the dream of scale. She studied chemistry, experimented with formulas, watched carefully as black women struggled with products that damaged more than they healed. And just like Walker, she saw what others ignored: need. But Malone moved differently, slower, quieter, more deliberate. She wasn't chasing recognition. She was constructing infrastructure, factories, training programs, distribution networks stretching across cities most companies refused to enter. What she created wasn't just a product line, it was an economy. By the early 1900s, her company, Poro, had grown into something astonishing. Thousands employed, money circulating through black neighborhoods with a rhythm that felt almost impossible for the era. Women earning their own income, owning their time, building stability in a country designed to deny it. And Malone didn't stop there. She built an entire complex in St. Louis, a full city block dedicated to black success, factory floors humming with production, a school teaching business and beauty science, housing for workers, community spaces filled with movement and purpose, not charity, structure. That distinction matters because structure lasts longer than sympathy. And Malone understood longevity in a way few entrepreneurs ever do. At her peak, her wealth reached levels so extraordinary, historians still debate the numbers today. Millions, plural. In an America barely willing to admit black competence, she stood as one of the richest women alive. Not just black women, women, period. And here's where the story turns. Because power alone doesn't threaten systems, generosity does. Malone gave relentlessly, funding schools, supporting orphanages, donating to causes that lifted entire communities instead of just her own name. She poured wealth outward in a way capitalism rarely encourages, and that made her vulnerable, not to failure, to betrayal. The divorce came like a slow storm. Legal battles, courtrooms, judges who didn't look like her, deciding what her life's work was worth, money drained through fees, control slipping through technicalities written in language designed to confuse, and suddenly the empire she built with precision began to fracture under pressure she never created. By the time history reached for her story, her fortune had already been dismantled, which made erasing her easier, because America prefers its myths simple. One success story feels inspirational, 2 feels suspicious, 3 becomes dangerous. So Malone faded from textbooks, from conversations, from memory itself. Yet her fingerprints remained everywhere, in industries she shaped, in opportunities she created, in the very success of Walker, who once worked under her guidance before stepping into her own spotlight. That's the uncomfortable truth beneath the silence. The blueprint existed before the legend, and the blueprint was almost forgotten completely. But Malone's story isn't just about wealth lost, it's about something deeper. What happens when black success grows too large to ignore, but too powerful to allow? Sometimes it's burned, like Greenwood. Sometimes it's rewritten, like Walker. And sometimes it's quietly dismantled piece by piece until nothing visible remains. 3 different endings, 1 identical purpose. Control the narrative, control the memory, control the future, because memory shapes possibility. If people believe success never existed, they stop searching for it. And that's where the real danger lives, not in stolen money, in stolen imagination. But even as Malone's name drifted towards silence, another story was already unfolding in a different corner of America. Not a beauty empire, not factories or formulas, land. Power rooted in soil instead of sales. Wealth rising from ownership instead of industry. And this next name matters for a reason history tried to hide. Because he proved something systems fear more than anything, that freedom without dependence is the hardest force in the world to control. So now the question changes again. If Annie Malone built an economic kingdom, What happens when a man builds an entire city? Long before flames touched Tulsa, before Greenwood became a symbol of what was lost, another story was already unfolding beneath the surface of the South. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. The kind of steady that quietly reshapes the future while nobody is looking. His name was Robert Reed Church, and unlike the legends that would come later, his rise didn't begin with opportunity. It began with survival. Born in 1839, inside a country that still called human beings property, Church entered life already counted as someone else's asset. No choice, no ownership, no protection, just existence measured in labor and obedience. Then history cracked open. War ended slavery on paper, but paper freedom and real freedom were never the same thing. Because when chains disappear overnight, power doesn't vanish with them. It adapts, shifts shape, finds new language. And in Memphis, Tennessee, that new language sounded like violence. The year was 1866. Black communities were just beginning to breathe differently, testing what life might feel like without constant control. But the reaction came fast. White mobs moved through the city with rage sharpened by fear. Homes attacked, families hunted, hope punished for existing too openly. Church was caught inside that storm, shot in the head, left for dead in the street. And here's the moment that changes everything. He didn't die. Pause there. Because survival after that kind of violence does something to a person's understanding of the world. It removes illusion, clarifies reality, forces a decision. Church made his quietly. If the world refused to protect him, he would build protection himself, not with revenge, not with speeches, with ownership. $50. That's all he started with. An amount small enough to disappear in most stories, but powerful enough in the right hands. He bought land. Again, land. Notice the pattern forming across these lives. Walker built industry. Malone built infrastructure. Church chose territory, because territory can't be erased as easily as memory. Or so he believed. Piece by piece, he expanded. Property turning into income. Income turning into leverage. Leverage turning into influence. Years passed, then decades, and something remarkable happened in plain sight. A man once counted as property became one of the wealthiest figures in Memphis. Not symbolic wealth, real control, businesses, real estate, money flowing through networks he owned instead of rented. By 1912, he crossed the line America feared most. $1 million again, another impossible number. Another crack in the story white supremacy needed people to believe. But Church's greatest move wasn't about profit. It was about space. Memphis decided black citizens didn't belong in public parks, didn't deserve gathering places, didn't qualify for leisure or dignity. Exclusion written into law, so ordinary it barely made headlines. Church didn't argue. He didn't beg for entry into spaces designed to humiliate him. He built a new one, $100,000 of his own money, spent to create Church Park and Auditorium, massive, beautiful, unavoidable, a cultural center rising where rejection once stood. Speakers filled the stage, music filled the air. Community filled the space with something systems could never fully suppress. Belonging. That act mattered more than wealth, because wealth proves possibility. But institutions prove permanence, and permanence terrifies power built on temporary control. Church wasn't just rich, he was independent. And independence spreads ideas faster than money ever could. His daughter carried that idea forward. Mary Church Terrell, stepping into education, activism, leadership. A continuation of momentum the system couldn't easily stop. Yet even this story began fading from mainstream memory. No dramatic fire, no single night of destruction, just quiet reduction, fewer mentions, shorter paragraphs, names slipping further from public awareness with each passing generation. Because erasure doesn't always arrive violently. Sometimes it simply waits. Waits for time to do the work Flames once did faster. But while Memphis was slowly forgetting church, another figure had already been shaping history from an entirely different direction. Not in the South, not after the Civil War, much earlier, much further west. And her story carries a different kind of danger because she didn't just build wealth, she financed rebellion, real rebellion, the kind that threatens systems at their roots instead of their surface. Which is why history buried her deeper than most, deeper than Walker, deeper than Malone, deeper even than the ashes of Greenwood. So now the question shifts again. If Robert Reed Church proved ownership could create freedom, what happens when a woman uses her fortune to try to destroy slavery itself? Some names are erased because they became too powerful. Others disappear because they became too dangerous. Mary Ellen Pleasant was both. And that combination is exactly why most people have never heard of her. Before the Civil War reshaped the nation, before emancipation rewrote the law, before the South collapsed under its own violence, Pleasant was already moving through America with a different kind of intention. Quiet, careful, invisible in the way only the smartest operators learn to be. Because survival, for a black woman in the 1800s, required more than courage. It required strategy. Even the details of her birth remain uncertain, records blurred, dates debated, origins obscured. Was she born enslaved? Was she born free? History never settled the question, and that uncertainty became the first layer of her disappearance. But what cannot be debated is what she built once she reached California. San Francisco in the mid-1800s was exploding with opportunity. Gold money, railroad money, speculation money, wealth changing hands faster than rules could keep up. And inside that chaos, Pleasant found space to move. She worked publicly as a cook, served meals, watched conversations, learned who controlled which doors. But privately, she was doing something entirely different. Investing, boarding houses, real estate, financial partnerships hidden beneath polite society's surface, money multiplying in silence, because the safest place to build power is where nobody expects to find it. By the 1850s, she wasn't just comfortable. She was wealthy on a scale almost impossible to imagine for a black woman of that era. Some estimates place her fortune in the tens of millions in today's dollars, enough to influence politics, enough to change outcomes, enough to become a threat. And Pleasant understood something critical about wealth. Money alone doesn't create freedom. Action does. So she made a decision few people in history ever dare to make. She funded rebellion. Not metaphorical rebellion, not speeches or pamphlets. Armed resistance. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, one of the most explosive anti-slavery actions in American history, didn't move forward on belief alone. It needed money. Pleasant provided it. $30,000, an enormous sum at the time, a direct investment in tearing slavery out at the root. Think about the risk of that moment. If discovered, she could have lost everything: freedom, fortune, life itself. But she moved anyway, because some people don't just want survival. They want transformation. The raid failed. History remembers the violence, the execution, the national shockwave that followed. But history rarely remembers the woman who helped make it possible. That silence isn't random. Acknowledging her role would mean admitting that a black woman helped finance the beginning of slavery's collapse, and certain truths feel too disruptive to repeat comfortably. After the Civil War, Pleasant didn't slow down. She shifted focus from rebellion to rights. San Francisco streetcar companies refused black passengers. Segregation hiding behind polite language and local policy. Pleasant fought back in court, decades before civil rights became a national movement, and she won. A legal victory in 1866 that echoed forward nearly a century before Rosa Parks's quiet refusal on a bus. But winning never guarantees safety, because power resents being challenged, especially by someone it believes should remain invisible. A white business partner turned against her. Legal battles followed. Newspapers joined the attack, and the language they used tells you everything about the era. Not businesswoman, not investor, not civil rights pioneer. They called her a witch, a voodoo queen, a manipulator hiding behind superstition. Smear campaigns disguised as journalism. Character assassination dressed as entertainment. The goal wasn't truth, it was isolation. Because once reputation falls, wealth becomes easier to steal. Courts ruled against her. Assets slipped away. Fortune drained through decisions shaped more by race than law. And by the time she died in 1904, one of the most influential black women in the American history had nearly vanished from public memory. No monuments, no widespread recognition, no national story honoring what she risked. Just silence. But silence has a weakness. It depends on nobody looking too closely. And eventually, someone always does. Because patterns leave traces, money leaves records, courage leaves consequences. Pleasant's story survived in fragments, whispers across decades, waiting for someone willing to listen. And when you line her life beside the others, Walker, Malone, Church, a clearer picture begins to form. Black wealth wasn't rare. Black power wasn't impossible. Black resistance wasn't accidental. It was systematic, intentional, growing, which explains why the response became systematic too. Burn the cities, rewrite the textbooks, discredit the leaders, erase the memory. Different methods, same objective. Control what the future believes about the past, because belief shapes expectation, and expectation shapes possibility. But even as Pleasant's legacy faded into shadow, another story was rising in the American South. A man born in a log cabin, a child of formerly enslaved parents, someone who would live long enough to see the civil rights movement explode across the nation, and wealthy enough to help fund the fight itself. His empire wasn't hidden in whispers. It stood in brick and concrete, visible to anyone willing to look, and that visibility made him dangerous in a completely new way. So the question changes once more. If Mary Ellen Pleasant helped finance the destruction of slavery, what happens when black wealth begins financing the movement that challenges segregation itself? By the time the 20th century began to take shape, the rules of America had changed on paper, but not in practice. Slavery was gone, chains were illegal, freedom had a date stamped into law, and yet the system still found ways to control movement, limit opportunity, and punish ambition that grew too visible. Because domination doesn't disappear, it evolves. New language, new policies, same outcome. And inside that evolving landscape, a boy was born in 1892 in a place that offered almost nothing, a log cabin. Parents who had known slavery personally, a future that, according to every social rule of the time, should have remained small. His name was A.G. Gaston, and unlike the stories of sudden fortune people like to believe, his rise didn't begin with luck. It began with work most people would never choose. Selling firewood, selling peanuts, anything that turned effort into coins, anything that moved him one step beyond the limits waiting around him. Then came the coal mines, darkness, danger, air thick with dust and uncertainty, the kind of labor designed to extract strength from the body while giving almost nothing back. But mines also teach something unexpected. They teach how systems operate, who profits, who risks, who disappears unnoticed. And Gaston was always watching. Because observation is often the first form of resistance, when he finally stepped out of the mines, he didn't chase comfort. He chased structure, insurance, funeral services, financial institutions. Businesses rooted in needs that never disappear. One company became two became five became an entire network of black enterprise spreading through Birmingham, Alabama. Money circulating inside a community that had been intentionally denied access to capital for generations. That detail matters, because wealth alone doesn't threaten oppression. Independent systems do. By the mid-20th century, Gaston wasn't just successful, he was powerful. Hotels, banks, real estate, industries tied together by ownership instead of permission. And ownership changes posture. It allows a person to stand differently, speak differently, refuse differently. Which brings us to 1963, Birmingham, one of the most violently segregated cities in America, a place where protest wasn't just risky, it was life-threatening. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived to challenge the system directly. Marches, boycotts, jail cells filling faster than the city expected. And movements like that need more than courage. They need infrastructure, safe rooms, meeting spaces, money to keep organizing when pressure rises. That's where Gaston's wealth became something else entirely. His motel turned into headquarters. Leaders gathered there, plans formed there. Hope stayed alive there when the streets outside felt hostile. And power noticed, because resistance backed by resources is harder to crush than resistance fueled by emotion alone. So violence answered again. A bomb exploded at Gaston's motel, an attempt to shatter both the building and the movement it sheltered. But destruction didn't end the story. Gaston rebuilt, brick by brick, wall by wall, refusing to let terror write the final sentence. That refusal is what makes his story different from the ones before. Walker created independence. Malone built community. Church built space. Pleasant funded rebellion. Gaston financed survival itself. He proved something systems fear deeply. When oppressed people control resources, they control endurance, and endurance changes outcomes. He lived to see the civil rights movement reshape America. Lived past 100 years. Lived long enough to watch laws fall that once seemed permanent. And when he died in 1996, his wealth had reached levels unimaginable for the boy in the log cabin. More than a fortune. A legacy of resistance built with balance sheets instead of bullets. Yet even his name rarely appears in the version of history most people learn first, because remembering him forces a difficult realization. The struggle for freedom wasn't powered by speeches alone. It was funded, protected, sustained by black wealth the system tried to limit. And that realization leads somewhere uncomfortable. If black millionaires helped drive the fight for civil rights, then inequality today can't be explained by lack of effort, which means the story America prefers starts to unravel. But Gaston's legacy isn't the final piece, because before insurance empires, before Birmingham, before the 20th century fully arrived, there was a woman walking across 2,000 miles of dust and danger, forced forward behind a wagon train that claimed ownership over her life. She carried no wealth, no protection, no guarantee she would survive the journey, only endurance. And endurance, when it refuses to break, can become something extraordinary. Her name was Biddy Mason, and her story might reveal the deepest truth of all, because she didn't just build wealth after freedom, she built it from nothing but freedom itself. So now the question sharpens one last time. If A.G. Gaston proved wealth could protect a movement, what happens when a woman proves freedom alone can create an empire? Some journeys are measured in miles, others are measured in transformation. Biddy Mason's journey was both. Before wealth, before ownership, before history tried to forget her name, there was only a road stretching west across dust and silence. She was born in 1818 in a world that didn't recognize her as fully human. No wages, no legal identity, no future she could choose for herself, just movement dictated by someone else's will. In 1848, that movement became literal. Her enslaver joined a wagon train heading toward California, a promise of opportunity for him, a forced march for her, 2,000 miles, not riding, walking, driving cattle, caring for her daughters, enduring heat, hunger, and exhaustion that would have broken most people long before the journey ended. And here's the detail that changes everything. California was supposed to be free, not perfect, not equal, but legally free, which meant something radical had happened without her permission. The ground beneath her feet had changed the rules of her existence. Her enslaver understood that danger immediately, because freedom, once visible, is almost impossible to hide again. So he planned to move her farther, to Texas, back into a place where chains would remain unquestioned. But Biddy Mason had already learned something on that road. She had learned that survival isn't the same as obedience, and when the moment came, she made a decision that reshaped her life forever. She went to court. Pause there. No money, no education, no social protection. Just courage strong enough to stand in front of a legal system never designed to defend someone like her. And she won. In 1856, Biddy Mason became legally free, not through kindness, not through charity, but through resistance. Freedom earned in a courtroom instead of granted on a battlefield. But freedom alone doesn't guarantee safety. Newly free black people across America often found themselves trapped in poverty just as harsh as slavery's shadow. Mason chose a different path. She worked, not glamorous work, not celebrated work, nursing, midwifery, caregiving, the kind of labor that keeps communities alive while rarely making headlines. But Mason understood something powerful. Service builds trust. Trust builds relationships. Relationships build opportunity. And opportunity, when used carefully, can turn survival into ownership. She saved every dollar she could, watched the city of Los Angeles grow around her, studied which land would matter later instead of now. Then she bought property, one piece at a time, quietly, strategically, because land, again, land, keeps returning in these stories for a reason. Land cannot be easily erased. Land carries memory even when people try to forget. By the 1880s, Mason had become one of the wealthiest black landowners in Los Angeles, a fortune worth hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time when most black Americans were denied even basic stability. From forced march to financial power, from property to property owner. And like the others before her, she didn't keep that wealth only for herself. She fed the hungry, paid debts for families on the edge of losing everything, funded churches and schools, visited prisoners who had no one else left. Because true freedom doesn't end with the self, it expands outward. Yet when she died in 1891, the city she helped shape didn't honor her loudly. No grand monuments, no national remembrance. For decades, her grave remained unmarked, as if history itself was unsure whether her story should be remembered at all. That silence feels familiar now, doesn't it? Different lives, same pattern. Rise, build, give, disappear. Not always through fire, not always through violence, sometimes through something quieter. Neglect disguised as forgetting. But forgetting only works until someone starts searching. And when historians finally followed property records, old documents, buried traces of ownership, Biddy Mason's story reemerged from the shadows. Proof that black wealth in America was never as rare as textbooks suggested. Proof that success didn't begin in the 20th century, didn't begin after civil rights, didn't begin with permission. It had been there all along, built by people who refused to remain invisible. And when you line every name together, Walker, Malone, Church, Pleasant, Gaston, Mason, and Gurley watching Tulsa burn, a deeper truth finally comes into focus. These weren't isolated miracles. They were a pattern, which means the destruction that followed wasn't random either. It was systematic. Because when too many people rise beyond control, systems designed for inequality must respond. Burn the districts, rewrite the memory, scatter the evidence, silence the names. But something unexpected happened instead. The story survived, hidden, fragmented, waiting. And once hidden stories begin returning to the surface, they don't come back quietly. They come back with questions, dangerous questions, questions about wealth, about power, about why entire histories disappear while others are repeated endlessly. Because if Black America once produced hundreds of millionaires despite slavery, despite Jim Crow, despite terror, then the present cannot be explained the way we were taught. And that realization leads to the most uncomfortable truth of all. Maybe the greatest theft in American history wasn't just land or money or lives. Maybe it was memory itself. So now the story moves beyond individual names into something even bigger. Because Tulsa wasn't the only place that burned, and what happened next reveals just how far a system will go to protect the lie. The question is, how many black cities had to disappear before America could pretend they never existed? Tulsa wasn't an accident. That's the first truth most people never hear. Because when a single tragedy stands alone, it feels like chaos, like something unpredictable, like history simply went wrong for a moment. But when the same thing happens again and again and again, it stops looking like chaos. It starts looking like design. Across the United States, from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, black communities were doing something the system said shouldn't be possible. They were stabilizing, land ownership rising, businesses multiplying, schools forming, money circulating inside neighborhoods instead of leaking outward. Small at first, quiet, easy to ignore, until they weren't. Because prosperity has a way of becoming visible, and visibility changes how power responds. Take Wilmington, North Carolina. Before Tulsa ever burned, Wilmington had already become a center of black political and economic strength. Black citizens held office. Black newspapers shaped public conversation. Black professionals moved through the city with a confidence that unsettled people who believed authority should never look that way. In 1898, white supremacists decided to correct that problem. Armed groups organized openly. Newspapers encouraged violence. Political leaders framed the coming attack as restoration instead of destruction. Then the city exploded. Black businesses burned. Families fled. Elected officials were forced out at gunpoint. A government was overthrown in broad daylight. Not hidden, not denied, just renamed. They didn't call it a massacre. They called it a coup, a correction, a return to order. Language can do that. Transform violence into something respectable enough to print. And once the language changes, memory follows. Now shift to Rosewood, Florida, another town, another black community building stability in a country determined to keep it fragile. Homes, churches, work, routine, until a single accusation, thin, familiar, convenient, ignited the same pattern again. White mobs moved through the town, gunfire, flames, people running into swamps to survive. By the time the smoke cleared, Rosewood was gone, not struggling, not rebuilding, gone. And for decades, Florida barely acknowledged it ever existed. Silence again, that quiet eraser working patiently across time. Then Elaine, Arkansas. Sharecroppers, black farmers trapped in debt cycles designed to keep them permanently poor, began organizing for fair payment. Not rebellion, not violence, just negotiation. But even the idea of economic independence felt dangerous enough to trigger another eruption. Troops arrived. Gunfire spread across the countryside. Bodies fell in numbers still debated today. And once more, the official story softened what really happened. Because official stories often protect official power. Look at the pattern closely. Prosperity appears. Fear grows. Violence erupts. History blurs. Different states, different years, same rhythm, which leads to an uncomfortable realization. If destruction keeps following black success, then the issue was never crime, never disorder, never the excuses written afterward. The issue was independence itself. Independence breaks hierarchy. Hierarchy protects power. Power reacts when threatened. And reaction, repeated often enough, becomes policy, even when no one writes it down directly. Between the end of slavery and the early 20th century, dozens of black towns and districts disappeared this way. Some burned, some emptied, some simply faded after pressure made survival impossible. Each loss carrying more than buildings, schools erased, generational wealth cut off, dreams interrupted before they could multiply. Because wealth isn't just money in a bank. It's time passed forward, security inherited, possibility expanding instead of restarting from zero. Destroy that. And you don't just hurt one generation, you reshape the future itself. That's the part rarely discussed openly. Violence didn't just punish success in the moment. It prevented success from compounding over time. And compounding is where real power lives. Imagine if Greenwood had survived, if Wilmington had continued growing, if Rosewood had expanded instead of disappearing. Imagine generations inheriting businesses instead of ashes, land instead of displacement, confidence instead of caution. The entire economic landscape of America might look different today. But imagination is dangerous when it challenges the story people prefer, so silence stayed in place until recently. Because buried history never stays buried forever. Documents resurface. Witnesses' descendants speak. Scholars begin connecting patterns once treated as isolated events. And once those connections appear, the narrative shifts. Not chaos, not coincidence, continuity. A long thread of resistance met by an equally long thread of suppression. Two forces pulling against each other across generations. And right in the middle of that tension stands the question everything circles back to. What happens when the truth finally becomes too visible to ignore? Because remembering isn't passive. It changes how people see the present. If the racial wealth gap traces back to burned towns and stolen property, then blame sounds different. Responsibility shifts. Explanations collapse, which is why memory itself becomes contested ground. Who controls the past, guides the future, and that brings the story to its final turn. Because once you understand the pattern, the rise, the destruction, the silence, you're forced to confront something even larger than history. You're forced to ask what survival looks like now. Not in the past, not in textbooks, right here. Because the greatest threat to any system built on forgetting is a generation that starts remembering on purpose. And once remembering begins, it rarely stops with 7 names. It keeps going, searching, recovering stories that were never meant to return, which leads to the final question this journey has been building toward. If the past was erased to control the future, what happens when the future refuses to forget? Erasure is never perfect. That's the quiet mistake every system makes when it tries to control memory. Because buildings burn fast, paper disappears easily, witnesses grow old. But truth has a different timeline. It hides, it waits, and eventually it surfaces. For decades after the destruction of black wealth across America, the silence felt complete. Children grew up in cities that never mentioned what once stood on the very ground beneath them. Schools taught progress without interruption. History books skipped entire chapters as if success had never existed to be stolen. And when something isn't taught, it slowly feels like it never happened at all. That illusion lasted longer than anyone expected, until the evidence began returning, not loudly, not dramatically, just small discoveries at first. Property records found in courthouse basements, old photographs tucked inside family Bibles, newspaper clippings saved by people who refused to let memory disappear completely, fragments, alone. Each fragment looked insignificant. Together, they formed something impossible to ignore. Proof. Proof that wealth had existed. Proof that communities had thrived. Proof that destruction was not accidental. And once proof appears, silence becomes harder to maintain. Take Tulsa again. Not the fire everyone remembers, but what came after. For generations, survivors told their children what the world refused to acknowledge. Stories passed quietly at dinner tables. Warnings wrapped inside family history. Names spoken carefully so they wouldn't disappear completely. Memory became resistance, because remembering what was taken kept the lie from becoming permanent. Then, late in the 20th century, something shifted. Researchers started asking questions the previous generation had been discouraged from asking. Local activists pushed for investigations. Descendants demanded recognition, and slowly, the official story began to crack. Mass graves searched for, testimonies recorded, state commissions forced to confront what silence had hidden. Not full justice, not complete repair, but acknowledgement. And acknowledgement matters because it changes what denial can survive. The same pattern appeared in other places too. Rosewood, once treated like rumor, was finally investigated. Survivors testified publicly. Compensation, small, delayed, imperfect, was eventually granted. Not enough to rebuild a town, but enough to confirm the truth. Wilmington's overthrow, once framed as political necessity, was re-examined and renamed for what it actually was: a violent seizure of power. Language shifted again, and when language shifts toward truth, memory follows. This is how buried history returns, not all at once, not cleanly, but steadily. And every recovered story changes the meaning of the present, because once people understand that loss was engineered, not accidental, the conversation about inequality transforms completely. It stops being about personal failure, stops being about cultural weakness, stops being about individual choices, and starts being about interruption. Wealth interrupted, safety interrupted, continuity interrupted, generations forced to restart from the same starting line again and again and again. That cycle is invisible unless you know where to look, which is why recovering history is more than academic work. It's structural. It explains outcomes people were taught to misunderstand. And once explanation replaces myth, something powerful happens. Blame loses its foundation, because you cannot blame a community for lacking inheritance when inheritance was deliberately destroyed. You cannot blame effort when effort already succeeded once and was burned away. You cannot blame culture when culture produced entrepreneurs, bankers, builders, landowners, long before modern opportunity even existed. Truth rearranges responsibility, and responsibility is what systems fear most. That fear explains why recognition always arrives slowly, why apologies feel cautious, why repair remains incomplete. Because admitting the full scale of loss would require confronting the scale of what was taken: land, capital, time, momentum, things that cannot be returned easily, if at all. But even incomplete truth has consequences. You can see it in how conversations change once hidden. History becomes visible. Young people asking different questions, communities tracing their own pasts, scholars expanding the archive beyond what official records preserved. The story grows larger every time someone looks closer, and that growth reveals one final misunderstanding at the center of everything. The goal of erasure was never just to hide the past, it was to shape belief about the future. If people believe success never existed, they stop imagining it can return. If communities believe loss was natural, they stop demanding repair. If history feels empty, hope feels unrealistic. That was the real objective. Not just destruction, but discouragement across generations. And yet, despite everything burned, forgotten, or denied, the evidence still came back, which means something survived that destruction couldn't reach: knowledge, memory, possibility. Quiet at first, but still alive. And once possibility survives, it can grow again. That's the part history rarely emphasizes, because survival is more dangerous than defeat. Defeat ends a story. Survival keeps writing new ones. And that leads to the next question, the one everything has been building toward. If black wealth was destroyed but not erased completely, what happens when a new generation starts rebuilding with the full truth finally visible? Here's the truth. Nobody wanted spoken out loud. Destruction only works if the future agrees to stay destroyed. And for a long time, it looked like that might actually happen. After the massacres, after the land theft, after the silence settled in like dust, something subtle began shaping the next century. Not chains, not mobs, Something quieter, doubt. Doubt planted carefully inside the story of Black America. A slow, repeating message whispered through schools, television, politics, economics, that success was rare, fragile, temporary. That wealth had never truly belonged. That independence was unrealistic. That survival itself should be considered enough. Because when a people stop expecting ownership, control becomes effortless. You don't need violence when belief does the work for you. That psychological shift was the final stage of the erasure. Not burning buildings, but lowering imagination. And imagination, more than money, is what systems fear losing control of. Because imagination is where rebuilding begins. And despite everything designed to shrink it, it never disappeared completely. You can see the evidence not in textbooks, but in patterns. Black business districts rising again in cities that once tried to erase them. Families quietly purchasing land without headlines. Entrepreneurs building networks outside traditional gatekeepers. Not identical to the past, but unmistakably connected to it. Because history doesn't repeat perfectly, it evolves. The same instinct that built Greenwood, that funded freedom suits, that turned survival into ownership, never left. It just adapted to a different battlefield. And this time, the struggle isn't only physical, it's informational. Control the narrative and you control expectation. Control expectation and you control behavior. Control behavior and inequality maintains itself without visible force. That's why recovering buried history feels threatening to some people even today. Because once the past proves that Black wealth existed at scale, every modern excuse collapses instantly. The conversation shifts from why hasn't success happened to why was success interrupted? And those are two very different questions. One blames the victim, the other investigates the system. That shift alone changes political arguments, economic debates, educational priorities, and national memory, which explains why acknowledgement often arrives wrapped in discomfort, because truth demands responsibility, and responsibility demands action. But here's the part that matters most. Even without full repair, even without complete justice, something irreversible has already happened. The silence is breaking. More people know the names, more archives are opening, more descendants are speaking, more scholars are connecting patterns that once looked isolated. And once knowledge spreads, it cannot be pushed back underground the same way again. That's the real turning point. Not laws, not speeches, awareness. Because awareness rewrites possibility. A generation that knows wealth was stolen thinks differently than a generation taught wealth never existed. One accepts limits, the other questions them. And questions are where transformation begins. This is why remembering matters far beyond history. It reshapes identity. Instead of starting the story with oppression, you start it with achievement. Instead of seeing struggle as failure, you recognize interruption. Instead of asking, why aren't we there yet? You ask, what was taken and what can be rebuilt? Those are dangerous questions, not because they divide, but because they clarify. And clarity is the one thing erasure can never survive forever, which brings us back to where this all started. A man watching his empire burn, flames rising into the sky, a neighborhood erased in hours that had taken decades to build. They thought destroying the evidence would destroy the meaning. They were wrong, because the meaning was never in the buildings. It was in the proof. Proof that freedom could become ownership. Proof that ownership could become power. proof that power could exist even inside a system designed to prevent it. That proof survived, hidden in stories, hidden in records, hidden in memory, waiting for the moment someone would look again, and now you've seen it. Which means the final question is no longer about the past, it's about the future. If entire black economies were built once, from nothing, under open hostility, without protection, what becomes possible with knowledge, connection, and truth finally visible? Because history's biggest secret isn't what was destroyed, it's what destruction failed to stop. And once you understand that, the story changes from tragedy to unfinished beginning.